Today, we're thrilled to have Curtis Sprouse as our speaker. He's going to be talking about what moves ideas to success, and he'll address the knowledge and funding gaps that often restrict great ideas from advancing, and how the Institute for Biomedical Entrepreneurship is addressing these two areas of opportunity. Just a quick background on Curtis. He is the president and CEO of Eureka and sits on the board of directors for the Institute for Biomedical Entrepreneurship. He has extensive experience with Fortune 500 pharmaceutical, biotech, healthcare-related software, and device companies. Curtis is an early and middle stage life science entrepreneur with a significant track record of raising capital, building life science-driven businesses, creating value, and setting the stage for investor exit. Curtis, thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to have you here. Before I hand it over, real quick, for anybody who has questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop those in your control panel in the little questions tab, and we will get to all of those at the very end. And really quick before we get started, we will be passing out or emailing out a copy of Curtis's presentation today following the presentation. So don't worry about writing everything down. We'll get it to you afterwards. And with all that being said, Curtis, go ahead and take the floor, and thanks for being here today.
Kelsey, thanks for the introduction. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone today. Is the sound okay on your end?
Yeah, sounds great.
Wonderful. So I'm going to start today to tell you a little bit of a story. My goal today is to talk a little bit about you as individuals. Those of you that are interested in being entrepreneurial or developing an idea or advancing an idea, what I'll do is I'll take you through an initiative that I'm working with, a number of people from industry, academic institutions, and government that have come together to try to come up with a solution to this translation problem that we have, the ability to advance ideas in an effective way. I'm going to give a shameless plug to a very good friend of mine, Greg Fairbrothers, because I stole the title for this presentation today from his book. Much of what I'm going to talk about today is contained in a book that Greg published years ago. Greg is a key member of this initiative that I'm going to talk a little bit about today. And if you are interested in really diving into the detail of much of what I'm talking about today, it's contained in this book. So we have Greg to thank for the fact that he's taken a lifetime of experience and actually condensed it into a text that we can all use as a reference guide. A little bit of background just on me to give you an idea of where I came from. I know Kelsey did a very nice introduction about where I am, but I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, went to a small liberal arts college, Westminster College. From there, I went into public accounting. I spent a time with Ernst & Young. It was actually Ernst & Winnie. That's how old I am, back when I first came out of school. And then had a series of positions as a CFO and a CEO for a number of startups. Staff support on duty were two companies that I founded and I actually ran and then sold for the investors. And in 1993, I founded a company called Boston Market Strategies. It was a consulting firm that focused in two primary areas. Number one was the pricing of products, biopharma and devices, and serving as a liaison between the manufacturers and developers and the third-party payers. What we were doing was developing the pricing strategies that would optimize the return on the asset over the life cycle of that asset. The second practice that I ran was one around clinical trial process efficiency. As we needed data to economically power the models that substantiated our pricing, we had to develop efficient ways to capture that data. And we gained great insight into how to do that through the consulting work that we did in that area. As a result of that work, I ended up starting a software company, Eyeball, to facilitate the advancement of imaging in particular in clinical research. And I ended up teaching at the School of Medicine at Drexel for 3 years, helping MDs and PhDs better manage clinical research. I did a stint as a CFO and a COO of a publicly traded company that recovered ships. Interesting part of my life and a story for another time. And I spent a few years as the worldwide head of sales and marketing for Corona, which is the largest registry for rheumatoid arthritis We had a very interesting business model in that we not only maintained a very sophisticated registry that powered research and many publications, but we also had a biologic repository that we developed that was a offshoot of the registry itself that allowed several companies to do some very interesting research. And as Kelsey said before, I run Eureka Connect and IBE. When we look at the idea of how to advance or do translation, one of the things I think is extremely important is this idea of building the individual. How do we make each of you a better version of you? And how do we do that in an objective way? One of the reasons I founded Eureka Connect in 2009 was that I realized after over 20 years in industry that we hadn't made really any advances that were monumental, that many of the challenges that we were dealing with when I was in my 20s as I approached 50 were the same challenges that we were facing, and they were becoming more complicated by the very market factors that we had to navigate. And one of the other takeaways I had is that we really don't formally train people how to lead. We put them in areas of responsibility, we advance and increase their responsibility, but we really don't formally teach them how to lead. And one of the ideas I had in forming Eureka Connect is that we could objectively do that, help individuals understand what it takes to be a great leader, and then how to actually develop those individuals to act and react in a way that's more effective. In order to do that, what I figured is that we needed to understand sort of behavioral mechanism of action. What is it that causes people to act and react the way they do? You can't develop or direct development of the individual if you don't know where they're starting from. And many of the theories on leadership are not applicable if they're not understood in the context of the individual. So the idea behind the formation of Eureka Connect was to address that. And what I thought I might do today is talk a little bit about that, to just give you a little bit of background on how we do it. But one of the things I want to set as a backdrop to that insight that I'm going to provide you through some slides and some data is that great leadership is about consistency and balance. Our data shows that the ability to develop connections to a broad spectrum of people and the ability to navigate a broad spectrum of challenges is inherently necessary in translating and advancing an idea. And those are the very components of leadership that can be developed, and that development can be directed. So that's some of what I do. It's a large part of what I do on a daily basis. So how do we do it? We define the behaviors that drive action and reaction. We help people understand the magnitude of those behaviors. It's one thing to say someone's stubborn. It's another thing to put it on a scale and show them where they are relative to the rest of the population. We focus the development on strengths. We help people understand where within their profile they have particular strengths, and we help them understand how to leverage that based on the theory of leadership. So what I thought might be interesting is to just share some data with you to help for you to visually understand this. We look at behavioral traits in two different ways. We look at them in genetic factors, things that are sort of hardwired. And when I say genetics, what we found is that if you look at these particular behaviors, energy, dominance, reflectivity, authority, discipline, and competing, that over the course of a career, 20 or 30 years, which we've monitored thousands of people over that span of time, we find that these scores don't really change. That once you identify a steady state for these particular behaviors, they don't tend to vary a whole lot. Now, that being said, things like trauma or major events in one's life can affect energy, how fast I navigate life, or dominance, my need to control a situation, discipline, my ability to set goals and hold people accountable, competing, the approach that I take to competing. Everyone competes. At the highest end of the scale, you're aggressive, and at the lowest end of the scale, you're internal. But understanding the magnitude of these behavioral traits is important And I'll give you a little bit of reasons why in a moment. The other side of the equation is the learned behaviors. These are the ones we can change. We tend to manage the genetics, energy, how fast I talk. My energy score is very high. I talk a mile a minute. I apologize for those of you that might not like that pace, but that's sort of my natural cadence. And as much as I think about it and try to slow down, I'll tend to speed up eventually because that's just how I'm wired. The same can be said for someone that has a lower energy score, where they might talk at a much slower pace and they might not be able to get through the presentation as quickly. The learned behaviors are just that. And I think there's some really interesting insight to be garnered from the learned behaviors. Many people believe being an introvert is a genetic dynamic of personality. Our research shows that it is not, that the ability to build connections, show care and compassion, to communicate and collaborate are all learned behaviors. There are genetic factors that affect it, but things like social skills, the ability to connect, social skills can be developed. One is not born with a limited ability to connect or develop connections to others. One might practice being introverted their whole life because someone told them early on they were, but it is not a given that one has to maintain that kind of an approach. So we look at things like motivational theory, what drives us, the genetic drivers. And while having them is beneficial, it makes life easier, it's not necessary. One does not have to be high energy, high dominance, high discipline, and high competing to be wildly successful. It does help to have these traits. It makes it easier. But what we have found is that it's far more important to be able to manage situations and people. Situationally managing conflict, one that does it well will be far more effective than a person that's talented that does not. So we frame the idea of how one engages in conflict based on 5 behavioral traits. This idea of compromise. Am I open-minded at a level that I can be effective? Competing. Do I try to win at all costs when engaged in conflict? This particular profile shows a person who's a real person that is actually overly competitive. They try to win at all costs. They're not a very good collaborator. Their frequency of interaction is challenged. They tend to be more introverted. They don't avoid, but they also don't accommodate. This person can come in open-minded, but become stubborn very quickly and be very aggressive in their need to achieve an objective. This is not a profile that's conducive to productive outcomes. Helping people understand the magnitude of that pushback, their stubbornness, is important, because this person, when I first approached them, and said, well, yeah, I know I'm stubborn, but it's not an issue. It's not a problem. It is a problem. And the reason it's a problem is because many people will shut down in the midst of this type of personality. They will not engage. And it doesn't matter how smart they are or how talented they are. Their very approach to resolving a disagreement or a conflict situation will result in, the most of the time, about 50% of the population will reject or just not engage. The other important factor to think about, and one of many, is this idea of interpersonal skills. I mentioned it earlier, this idea of being introverted versus extroverted. This particular person, it's the same person that I showed you earlier, the conflict profile on, has limited social skills. They have a hard time connecting, building connections. They can build connections with a very small group of family, friends, and colleagues, but they don't tend to build connections outside of that. Goodwill, lower. They present as more transactional. They care, but they don't tend to show it. This person has a hard time with groups or people outside their immediate circle because they're very hard to read. It's hard for others to interpret where they stand with this type of a person. And when you add to it the fact that they can be very stubborn, this person is very challenged to engage in large groups or with people they haven't met before, and they are challenged to deal with sometimes disagreement or conflict or issues that might require groupthink or collaboration. This person is extremely talented, I showed you the genetic profile earlier. Very, very talented individual, but they do struggle with those interactions. And as a result, they never optimize the use of that talent. So a lot of what we do with this behavioral data is help the person understand how to actually leverage the talent and balance these conflict and interpersonal models. So that's just a little preview. I won't belabor it. I think what I'd like to do now is transition a little bit more to what is the environment that the person needs to navigate. If we look at the biomedical innovation ecosystem, we see that it's a very complicated ecosystem. There are many different players that you will have to interact with, from the academic institutions to their patent offices. You will have colleagues within those institutions that you'll have to work with to not only advance the science itself, but to agree on how that science will be developed, whether it's within the institution or with partners, industry partners. How will that be financed through government financing, NIH grants, or through private financing, venture capital, angel investors? There's a number of decisions that need to be made. And this is not an easy landscape to maneuver or navigate. Some of the other factors are the capital itself. How are early stage ideas financed? We have NIH budgets, approximately in 2015, approximately $30 billion was available to early stage science and ideas. You also have the private sector, where we have almost 60 billion that was identified in 2015. Over $90 billion in capital. But we know it's not always easy to align that capital with good ideas. I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go through the remainder of my presentation today. There are a significant number of important cures out there. I mean, the reality of it is that we're seeing a number of really transformative medications come to market. We have the first gene therapy drugs that are now available, cell therapy for the treatment of pediatric lymphoma as an example. Many lives will be saved as a result of the science that's being availed to us. So there is a great opportunity for us. But within that opportunity, there's also a concern that this environment that we live in, the model that exists today, is not sustainable. And I'll get into that. What we're finding now is that there is a decline in the number of new medical entities or drugs that we're seeing come to market. And we're all seeing an exponential increase in the cost of developing ideas. So we have a decline in the number of ideas and an increase in cost. And that cost is not stagnating. It's continuing to escalate. If we look, the process is becoming more lengthy in many cases because of the sophistication of the science. That we are now in a position where the easy science has been done and the challenges are more daunting. It requires a different approach, and the sophistication of the process by which ideas are going to be approved will be more intricate and require a greater and heightened burden on the process by which the idea is developed, tested, and proved. If we look, the root cause is really that the cost of failures are increasing at an exponential rate. And you can see here by the phases of development how the failure rate continues to increase. As I said earlier, the cost of failure is also exponentially increasing. We have about a 20% per year increase in the cost of failure, which has really driven up the cost of a drug, meaning you have to consider, if you're a large company within an industry, that you not only have the cost of developing the asset itself, which could be $300 to $400 million, but you have the exponential cost of failures that has to be considered and factored into your R&D development and budgets. So what's happened here? What we have is we've declined in the drug R&D output. And why this has happened is industry consolidation. Many of the big players within industry have become more risk adverse. They are not looking to invest in early stage technology. Much of the early stage technology they're acquiring, they're looking to academic institutions to develop the innovation, and they're looking to acquire technology that they can advance. But they're also looking for technologies that have been de-risked, things that don't have inherently high levels of risk and that have gone through a certain level of or a certain process to decrease the likelihood of failure. Industry is focusing more on the later stage opportunities and opportunities that can be brought to market in a relatively short period of time with a relatively high level of success. The dramatic increase in the number of drugs and the pricing of drugs. If we look at the area of rheumatoid arthritis in and of itself, we see an escalation in cost in the drugs in that sector, exponential increase over the last 15 years. We see that there are other areas where that has occurred. As I mentioned earlier, there's a slow in R&D growth, both from an industry and government perspective. And there's an escalation of costs at all levels. The payer has become more powerful, which is another dynamic of market that's going to continue. When you first look and go back to the early 90s, when I first started getting involved with pricing of drugs and negotiating contracts with third-party payers, the formularies were pretty limited, and their ability to stop utilization or manage or influence utilization was fairly limited. But as those pharmacy benefit management companies have become more sophisticated, their ability to control and affect utilization of drug has become much greater. That dynamic will only increase. And as the data becomes better integrated and we're better able to understand the progression of disease, what we're going to find is that there are greater pressures placed on industry to bring forth drugs that are truly beneficial to the patient. And that burden will be harder and harder to overcome as the data becomes more precise and accurate and understanding how drugs actually work. I'm working with some companies now that are analyzing the effectiveness of drugs, and it's very disruptive to many of the formularies. Many of the formularies have been constructed based on the idea of where the maximal return was on a particular asset or a drug or a therapy. And the reality of it is that the outcomes associated with various drugs aren't in line with the economics. That will be corrected over time and put more pressure on the development of those ideas or therapies or products. The decline in the industry viability, I think I've made it pretty clear that there's a decrease in the number of assets being brought forth and the cost is increasing. If you continue to do the math, there becomes a point where the model isn't sustainable. It doesn't work anymore. You can't continue to sell a drug at a price point where you can underrate the cost of the development, and the model falls apart. Price controls will put a greater burden on that more quickly. And we are also faced with other dynamics that I haven't talked about. The decrease in NIH funding, the loss of research. These are all factors that are going to increase the need to improve and correct the market. So at this point, I probably have everybody very excited about the idea of doing translation, early stage development. You're probably all jumping up and down about the prospect and opportunity. The good news is that there's really phenomenal science out there, that we are at a time where the scientific knowledge and the ability to use science and advance the development of solutions is like nothing we've ever seen. So from a scientific perspective, the opportunities are endless. And there are ways to correct for this problems that we're faced with right now. Because they exist doesn't mean that they can't be overcome. And I'm fortunate enough to be involved with an initiative that is actually having success, trying to change the way the market works today. What makes up the right idea? Well, first of all, we have to understand what the value proposition is. One of the challenges we have in overcoming this translational gap is that there's a knowledge gap, that many innovators, many scientists, many people in R&D within industry don't understand the continuum, the entire process necessary to take an idea from concept to market. And that there is the potential to develop a better understanding of their science relative to a market, to a patient, to these factors that aren't necessarily considered in many scientific arenas or academic arenas. Um, there's another opportunity to help educate the innovator on the path, the process. The entire process, while it is complicated and sophisticated, it can be broken down. It can be broken into segments. There are a number of resources and people out there who will help you advance your thinking. One of the challenges you have is, how do you engage in that network? How do you develop that network? How do you learn at the same time you're trying to do? And that's one of the challenges that you're faced with now that we've been trying to solve through this initiative that I'm involved with. The other part of it is the team. I started with you as the individual. I started talking about, how do we take a person and make them a better version of themselves? How do we focus their development so they can continue to grow given the challenges they're going to face? Again, these things can all be done objectively. There are ways to do it in a more efficient and effective way that haven't been utilized in any scale to date. But there is an opportunity to develop the individual. And by developing the individual, what we do is we develop stronger teams. We're able to develop teams that are to better able to overcome adversity. And that's what we can do in a more deliberate and more focused way. We need to get more ideas through the pipeline. I didn't add the slide, I wish I had, but there's a slide that Greg Fairbrothers always draws, and it's basically a funnel. And if you think about the funnel, the ideas going into the top of the funnel are reduced down to the little pipe that comes out of the bottom. And what we have to do is think about making that pipe larger. We have to get more ideas that are going into the top to make it through the process. That only happens if we strengthen the individuals and the teams that are involved with developing the ideas. And that's an absolute necessity given the challenges, both scientifically and given the ecosystem that I outlined for you, that you're going to be faced with. It's not an impossibility, but it does require that we develop and strengthen the individuals and the teams, first and foremost. But by doing that, then we can start to overcome this gap, the valley of death, if you will, the knowledge gap and the funding gap that restricts the advancement of the idea. That we can help individuals develop ideas that think about patient and market dynamics, that think about how the product would scale in a manufacturing setting, to think about the regulatory landscape that could affect that particular asset or idea. These are all things that can be broken down, defined, and taught. And it's not that the innovator has to develop a mastery of all these areas. It's that the innovator has to understand and have a working knowledge of them and be able to know where to go to get the resources to help them perfect their science, but advance their idea. Why the gap exists? Some other insight into that is that the researchers, the clinical institutions, they focus on the R, not the D. They focus on the science and developing good science, interesting ideas, solutions. But the development requires another skill set, an area of awareness that many of them haven't been availed to. And it's not that they can't learn it, and it's not that they can't develop a working knowledge of it, but they haven't had to, and in many cases they haven't tried to, and then they haven't had the opportunity to. VCs and corporations, they really fund the translation. As I said, in my career, the venture capital community has moved more towards the products that are more further developed, excuse me. They want ideas that are de-risked. They'd rather overpay for an idea that they know has a great chance of making it to market than get a deal on something that's very questionable. We believe, myself and others that have come together to try to put together a solution, that there is an opportunity to give a model where objectively we can prove that you can do translation and de-risk the early stage idea. That you, through developing people and a network of people that have a better understanding of how to lead and collaborate, and combining that with a well thought out process by which you de-risk the idea, that you can move the investment community back to early stage and get more capital aligned with those early stage ideas. The biopharma community is not set up to develop early stage ideas, and in the last 10 years, they've moved further and further away from that. It's easier for them to acquire the resource or the idea than to develop it themselves. And most ideas are not ready to be companies. That's another problem that we have, is that many times we try to establish a company before we know whether there's something there or not, which creates a cost. It delays the advancement of the idea. Many times the pivotal experiment that will help us to understand the viability and strength of that idea is not done until a tremendous amount of money has been expended, setting up a corporation and hiring people, or doing a lot of things that don't contribute to understanding the science and its relative value to a patient population. So what happened in 2015, I was part of a group that came together with this idea that we could solve the translation problem, that we could develop a model, a resource that could be tapped into by academic institutions and industry to more efficiently advance ideas. In order for us to put together a solution, we had several meetings in Cambridge where we had over 100 individuals from all over the world come together to think about how would we solve this problem. And what we did in those meetings is that we broke these 100 individuals up into teams. We took CEOs from biotech companies and C-level executives from biopharma industry and academics, professors, and world-renowned researchers. And we took government officials, people from NIH. We had individuals from Asia. We had people from Europe, South America, and the United States, all part of this group. And when we sent them off into their teams, we told them they had 2 days to come up with a solution. And we basically made them compete against each other. Who could come up with the best idea? Who will come up with the solution that solves this translation problem? And what came back from the myriad of presentations that we saw through those meetings was that there were two fundamental problems that I alluded to earlier. There was a knowledge gap and a funding gap. So I have a lot of, I've been blessed with being able to work with some of the brightest people in our industry, and Tony Manning, who's our chairman, he's the worldwide head of R&D at Momenta Pharmaceutical. Henry Skinner, who's the managing director for Tekla Ventures. Greg Fairbrothers, who is the CEO and founder of a number of biotech companies, sits on a number of boards. And then Chuck Yon, who is general counsel for Checkmate Pharmaceuticals. Chuck has been a attorney with Mintz Levin, running their biopharma practice for years. He's been general counsel for large pharma companies. He is involved with Cooley Pharmaceuticals and was general counsel there when they did their exit to Pfizer. This group of individuals has helped me put together this thing called the Institute for Biomedical Entrepreneurship. Basically what it is it's a group of now over 600 people that are focused on this idea of solving this translation problem. The solution to the problem that we outlined, or I outlined earlier in my presentation. And what does that look like? What is it that this group of people are doing? Well, we basically have set up an educational arm. Right now, what it looks like is a 5-day curriculum whereby the individuals that participate are exposed to this list of topics. So there are formal classes that are taught by industry experts. The board, all the board members that you saw earlier are all faculty members in the IBE. And what we do is we take people through and provide them an awareness, an understanding of each of these areas and others. Other areas are covered, not just the ones that I've outlined here. But what we're doing is we're exposing the innovator to the broader thinking And what happens is that during that 5-day program, each individual has to participate on a team. They actually have to be working on a solution. They can either be leading an idea that they may have brought from their institution or join a team, but by the end of the first day, they have to start to think about joining a team. And for the remainder of their time, for the 4 days that they will spend with their colleagues from industry, academia, what they have to do is develop that idea and be ready to pitch it to real investors on the 5th day. So there is a graduation. There's a point at which you have to take your idea, develop a business plan, and present that business plan. And you have 10 minutes to present, 10 minutes of feedback from a panel of real investors, and then 10 minutes of your colleagues, others within that class environment, who provide you feedback and insight around your idea. The 5-day class is not the end. It's only the beginning. What it's meant to do is get people to think in a broader spectrum, to get them to develop a thirst and hunger to learn more, to advance their understanding of the market so that they can more appropriately develop their science and technology. It is not meant to be the end all be all, but the starting line, if you will. And the network that we've developed, now over 600 people, comprised of over 102 alumni and I think it's actually over 100 faculty members now, given that we have a class coming up in September and October. This network is the key because it affords and allows for continuing education. It exposes individuals to people that have been through it, that have had the experience, that have had the challenges, have had the failures, who have had the successes. And it allows people to tap into this network to advance their own thinking, but find the complement of resources they may need to continue to advance their ideas. And that support, what does it look like? It looks like mentoring, advisors. To date, we have a number of initiatives, and I'll give you a little outline of that in just a moment, that have been brought forth by our alumni. The faculty and membership, they don't ask to be paid. They are volunteering their time to help people understand how they can become better versions of themselves and advance their thinking. In some cases, those individuals may be retained as advisors or board members or consultants, but for the most part, much of the work that's being done right now is being done through the network because people want to see ideas advanced. And the last part is capital. When we first started this idea of this particular solution, we thought we were going to raise a fund. And through many bright investors, we've been talked out of that idea. What we're doing now is we're starting to partner with venture funds. And we're looking at those funds that are between 100 and 250 million that are looking for a way for them to test ideas, use the IB as a laboratory to develop individuals and concepts to help to de-risk them to the very process of understanding, and also for them to find a place where they can identify technologies that are worthy of investment. These funds are funds that are looking to do translational investment. They are looking to do early stage investment, and they are looking for those innovators and ideas that are worthy of their investment, time, and support. So the IB, in a relatively short period of time, November 2016 is when we launched our first program, has this vision of developing a robust international initiative that helps innovators collaborate worldwide, not just within the US, but that they can work with their European and Asian colleagues, South America, other markets. Because as we know, the idea is not only to get the product to market, but to avail it to the broadest spectrum of patients that could benefit from these therapies. So the IB has thought about this concept and how to develop an international network. And our goal is to continue to grow the network. We right now are doing 4 sessions a year, 2 in the US, 2 in Europe. We look to expand that into Europe and expand the number of sessions, and continue to grow the network and the supporting, developing not only the supporting network, but developing more formal processes by which the support can be obtained and secured by those innovators who want to tap into it. And then last but not least, looking at not only the venture community, but looking at grants and other innovative ways to support and capitalize participation in this model. So to tell you a little bit about our success, since November of 2016, we've had 6 programs, 102 students have graduated. 13 new companies have been formed from academic institutions. These are ideas that were either spawned or in development when the individuals came to the IBE, and they have now negotiated or out-licensed the technology and gained some level of funding, whether that's through grants or through private funding. These ideas have been validated by an investment that's been made by some group or secured through some party. As an example, one of the ideas that you can go take a look at is a company by the name of 48 Hour Discovery out of the University of Alberta. Ratmir Didmer was one of the students in our 2016 session in November of 2016. His company now has 8 clients. It's a revenue producing company, 7 employees, 2 joint ventures. This is an example of what's possible, that somebody can come to a program, develop their idea, go back to their institution, secure support from the IBE, and actually realize the advancement of their idea into a real viable company. And we're seeing this happen not only with this is a data analytics company, but we're seeing it with therapies, we're seeing it with diagnostics, we're seeing it with devices. Of those 13 ideas that have been spawned out of academic institutions, all the different areas have been covered. And we see more and more ideas coming with the faculty from not only the alumni, but from faculty members advancing ideas. To date, we've identified over 35 projects now that have been spawned by participants from industry, people coming from organizations like Sanofi Pasteur and Momenta and Pfizer, where they go back to their institution, they pitch an idea, and then that idea has been funded by their boards or by their committees. And some of these individuals have gotten millions of dollars in funding to support an idea that was conceived or in development as they came to the IBE and advanced the thinking around that concept or therapy. How does it work? Most people are referred into the program, but I do get calls on occasion of people that want to participate. They've heard about the program, and we just ask them to make their case. There's no formal application at this point. What we do is we ask them for references, and we ask them to find a support mechanism. It's not inexpensive at this point because we don't have grant funding. We have to fund the program through participation fee. So we have a participation fee. It's $5,000 for the 5-day session. But there are scholarships available, partial scholarships that is. And we are now finding that many academic institutions are tapping into grants, both the international side. We're working with EIT Health, who's established in 8 regions in Europe. We're working with Duke University, Brown, BU, and a number of other institutions here in the United States who have developed not only internal funding mechanisms for participants, but also are looking for grant funding to support people. So there's an evolution of our model, not only in that it is growing, but the institutions that are partnering with us, both industry and academics, are finding ways to support the participation of individuals who are interested in doing translation. So that's my quick spin through sort of what I've been up to and what I'm working on and what I've been so fortunate to be part of. I'll stop talking now and I'll open it up for some questions. If any of you would like additional information, I've provided my contact information, and there's information on my behavioral science company, Eureka Connect, and the Institute itself. But I thank you today for your time and interest.
Awesome. Thank you for your time and that wonderful information and inspiration. I think we have some questions on this end. Does anyone have questions in here? I guess we don't. It's quiet over here, which is a good thing. Let me just check and see if we've got any online real quick. Nope.
Curtis, what
Yes.
other than pharmaceutical-based ideas, what other kind of companies were you dealing with in the last 2 years?
You mean what kind of things has the IBE seen? What kind of companies are participating?
What kind of startup companies or ideas have come through your doors?
Well, The IB has been supported by large players from industry. Sanofi Pasteur has been very active in their participation. They sponsor a number of scholarships on an annualized basis. We've seen from industry, companies like Pfizer, Momenta's been very active. Dana-Farber sends people to every session. From industry side, we're seeing therapeutics, we're seeing diagnostics. Typically, the diagnostics are part of a therapy where there's a diagnostic required for the therapy itself. We have actually seen manufacturing processes presented as ideas and concepts, micro manufacturing and how that would work, how it would scale. We've seen data analytic initiatives looking at how to do better and more effective drug targeting from industry. On the academic side, again, I'd say, we're seeing many of the same types of ideas, therapies, diagnostics, devices. We're also seeing devices that are part of multiple platforms where there might be a tracer or an imaging dynamic to the procedure, a surgical procedure that has a unique surgical device as as a component of the solution. So these are multifaceted ideas that have a therapeutic that could have a imaging component, could have a surgical device, and then there's a process associated with it. So it's not just a therapy or a diagnostic, but it can be even more complicated than that, which makes for very interesting presentations. Did I answer the question?
Yes, you did.
Alrighty, hey Curtis, it's Ryan Quinn. We should definitely catch up soon. I had a quick question. So after the couple day or week-long course, what type of continued support do you have after the course?
Well, we create an environment where people can network with alumni and their colleagues. It's really interesting, Ryan, because what has happened now is that participants, they sort of look at this as that, I'm the class of 2016. They really do, because you're with 25 people for the period of a week, you really get close. And it's intense because you've got, a couple days to put together your idea and present to real investors, and they don't really pull any punches. They've been part of the advisory group that you've had access to throughout the week. But the network itself has been an important part. You can reach out to the alumni. I know I'm doing a lot of advising. I sit on the board of a couple of those startups I mentioned earlier. So I've formally been made a board member of 2 of the startups. I'm an advisor. I've helped to identify some investors for a couple of the other ideas. We're out doing some sort of mini roadshows right now, asking investors to give advice on some of the technologies and whether they think they're ready for investment. But basically I take a phone call and people ask for help and we help. If I can't help, what I try to do is network you or others to people within the IBE that could provide the help, the access, the insight. I know Greg Fairbrothers and we have a call with a associate professor out of Brown University that has a platform. We're working with another woman that has a cancer platform out of Dana-Farber, where we're going to be doing meetings with investors. This is just activity this week on several of the ideas that have been spawned out of the IBE. We haven't formalized as much as I'd like, Ryan, but we're working towards that. But there's plenty of support because of the size of the network.
Okay, no, that sounds great. I guess one quick follow-up question on that. So you said, after the week you get to present in front of investors. Has there been any investment into companies, or what's the total dollar amount?
It's hard to track the total investment that's been aligned with the ideas from industry and from the academics, in large part because it's just hard to keep up with it. We haven't done a good job of formally tracking. On the industry side, it's really hard to track because they don't necessarily want to disclose it. We do have a white paper, though, that we just published, and I noticed on the IBEinc.org link, there's a link on the publications and news. It's a white paper that Tony Manning wrote around how the Momenta is leveraging the IB as a resource to advance their R&D. It's an interesting paper. If you can't get the link, don't hesitate to reach out to me and I'll send a copy of it out to you. But what we're finding is that the ability to use the network is allowing people to gain access to funding. I'm aware of a couple situations where I know exactly what people have been able to secure for funding, but there's a number of other situations where I know people are getting funding, and I'm not privy to how much that is. But I know at Momenta, there's been several ideas been funded to the tune of $3 million plus. I know that at Sanofi Pasteur, they've invested millions of dollars in some of the ideas that have been developed or advanced through the IB. It's not that these ideas were necessarily conceived there, but some of the thinking around the ideas and how to advance them was matured and advanced through participation at the IB. I can also tell you that ideas have been killed as a result of the IB, that we've seen a number of ideas that were put forth as projects that never saw it to day 5. And some of these were ideas that industry had spent millions in developing, and it wasn't until they actually got to the IB that they realized these were not viable market solutions. But yet they'd spent years and literally tens of millions of dollars developing the idea, but no one had really thought about the commercial viability of the ideas.
Okay. Well, hey, thanks for your talk, Curtis. I'll definitely check out that white paper whenever I have some time.
Absolutely.
Curtis, it's Tammy again. What would you recommend for a startup company for their first reading adventure to learn about how to be either a more effective leader or how to be a more effective startup company? What would you recommend?
So I think from a standpoint of understanding this landscape, I think Greg's book is excellent. It's very well done. I think it's a comprehensive book. There's another book. Let me see if I can find it for you real quickly.
Okay, for the people that don't know what Greg's book is, can you tell them the name?
Yeah, it's actually on my first slide.
Okay, good.
Here, I'll go back.
If you don't mind, I think maybe your presentation's been updated a little bit since I last saw it. So if you can send out the final one so I can send it around, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I'll do that right at the conclusion of the call today. But let me go back here. There's the book, From Idea to Success by Greg Fairbrother's. There's another book written by Don Rose, and he's at the University of North Carolina. Let me see if I can get the title of his book, because off the top of my head. Let me see here if I can get it for you. What I'll do is I'll find the book. Oh, here it is, From Research to Revenue. Don Rose's book, I think, is another excellent book. From Research to Revenue. Don Rose served in much the same capacity as Greg Fairbrother's. Greg ran the entrepreneurial program at Dartmouth for 14 years. Don Rose runs the entrepreneurial program at University of North Carolina. Both of them were very involved in the development of this curriculum I just outlined for you earlier, that 5-day program. Greg was sort of the brains behind it, but we actually utilized insight from Harvard's entrepreneurial training program, MIT's, Stanford, University of North Carolina, and Dartmouth. So what we did was we basically took 8-week programs and we condensed them down into that 5-day course.
Great. Thank you so much, Curtis. You've been a great help. Thank you again for doing our webinar for us.
Oh, you're more than welcome. I appreciate the opportunity to present, and I hope it was helpful.